afternoon and welcome to the Palestine Center and Jerusalem Fund. My name is Noor Issa and I'm currently interning here at the Palestine Center. Today we are kicking off the first installment of our summer intern lecture series entitled Gaza in Perspective, Realities on the Ground, Representation in US Media, and Broader Implications. Our second panel will be next week on July 29th. We will be discussing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza with UNRWA's Matt Reynolds and Dr. Ilana Feldman of GWU. We will conclude our lecture series on August 5th, where we will examine the representation of the Gaza war in US media with Al Jazeera's Omar Badr and Edmund Gharib. I encourage you all to come to these as well. It has been just over 1 year since the start of the 50-day war in Gaza. The violence left more than 2,200 Palestinians dead, including more than 450 children. It left at least 11,000 Palestinians wounded, around 500,000 Palestinians displaced, and at least 20,000 homes destroyed. Needless to say, the last war in Gaza, the third in the last 8 years, has been catastrophic to say the least. This lecture series is meant to continue the discussion on Gaza from 3 different perspectives. Today we examine Gaza in the larger context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Palestinian plight. What is Gaza's role in the conflict, and how does Gaza complicate it? Does it work in Israel's favor to treat Gaza and the West Bank separately? How, if at all, is the Hamas leadership in Gaza working with the Palestinian Authority to navigate the marginalization of Gaza? These are just a few of the questions and points our speakers will be addressing in today's panel. I'd now like to take this moment to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Nathan J. Brown is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University and non-resident Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's the author of 6 books on Arab politics, including When Victory is Not an Option, Islamist Movements in Arab Politics, and Palestinian Politics After the Oslo Accords, Resuming Arab Palestine. He has been named a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a Carnegie Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar, and a Guggenheim Fellow. He currently serves as the President of the Middle East Studies Association. Dr. Yousef Munayyer, to his right, is the Executive Director of the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation. He holds a PhD in Government and Politics from the University of Maryland and has published widely on Israel and Palestine, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and the intersection of national security and civil liberties in the mainstream press. His writings have appeared in every major metropolitan newspaper in the United States, and he is frequently asked to comment on news programs covering the Middle East. He was also our former executive director, and we welcome him back here. We will have each panelist speak for approximately 15 minutes on the subject of the panel, and then we will turn to question and answer with our panelists for roughly 15 minutes. This is a friendly reminder to please turn off your cell phones or silence them now. Thank you. And first we're going to have Dr. Yousef Munayyer give remarks for around 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here and to the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center for inviting me, putting on this event. It's great to be here and it's great to see this wonderful institution continuing to do great work since I've left, and I look forward to being back here and addressing this audience in the future. I think it's very important that you've decided to make this your first conversation in your intern lecture series, and I look forward to the rest of that series. As you noted in your opening comments, we are a year removed now from the devastating war on the Gaza Strip, which lasted for 55 days and left over 2,200 Palestinians dead, the vast majority of whom were civilians, countless more injured and maimed for the rest of their lives, an untold number affected in ways which transcend physical injuries and billions upon billions of dollars worth of damage to civilian infrastructure. But too often, the Gaza Strip is seen and understood only through the prism of these wars, which have happened now 3 times in the last 7 years. and too often it is seen only through the prism of its tiny presence on the map of Palestine. And so I'm glad that you've framed this conversation by asking what is Gaza's role in the Palestine-Israel conflict and how it complicates the conflict. And I think first, to really appreciate what Gaza's role in the conflict is, it's important to think about what Gaza's role in Palestine is. And I think that because of all of the events and discourse around Gaza being dominated by what they have been dominated in recent years, we've lost sight of the importance and significance of the Gaza Strip to any eventual Palestinian state. It's important to remember that in terms of its population, Gaza's population is a very significant portion of the population of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. While the Gaza Strip makes up only 6% of the size of the West Bank, it actually holds 60% of the population of the West Bank. Think, for example, in terms of population, of the relationship between New York City and New York State. The largest city in Palestine is Gaza, the city of Gaza. While we often talk about all different kinds of resources, the most valuable resource to the Palestinian nation is perhaps its population. And in any future outcome where we're talking about a Palestinian state, the nearly 1.8 million people in Gaza are going to play an integral role in defining what that state is going to be like in terms of their participation in that state's representative structures and also as part of its national fabric. On an economic level, it's important also to remember that Gaza can be a hub of commerce and industry. Of course, today it is under Israeli siege, which has been piled on top of years of occupation. But long before that, Gaza had been a central point of exchange in the region for trade coming from Egypt, which, by the way, is and has historically been among Palestine's most significant trading partners. This industry and commerce has tremendous potential to once again be an engine of success and prosperity if the conditions of siege and occupation end. It's important also to remember that Gaza is a would-be Palestinian state's only free access to the outside world, because Gaza is the only part of Palestinian territory which borders the ocean. Of course, that ocean is blockaded currently by an Israeli naval blockade. But one cannot overstate the importance of the need for any independent Palestinian entity to have control over access to the outside world independently. It's also Palestine's only connection to Egypt. On top of the access that the sea provides to the outside world, of course, as we recall, there was once an airport that was built in Gaza, and built in Gaza for good reason, because it, of course, allows air traffic to enter into Palestinian soil from international airspace, and was, of course, destroyed some 15 years ago. We also have off that coast great potential for natural resource development in terms of natural gas, which we know has been discovered along the coast in recent years, and that the Israelis are working to develop and exploit. And I think that there are important possibilities for the development of those resources off the coast of Gaza in the future. On top of the natural resources, of course, the centuries old, if not millennia old, fishing industry of Gaza has been an important part of the local economy, again, also devastated by the siege to the point today where most of Gaza's fish comes from farming fish on land. But one can imagine that that industry as well can become robust if the conditions of siege and occupation end. So in terms of population and economy, the tiny Gaza Strip, which we often talk about as a tiny place, is actually a dynamic center that is integral to the Palestinian nation and in any outcome would play a significant role in contributing to shaping the Palestinian future. The second question, or second part of the question, is how Gaza complicates the conflict. And I think there are a couple of complicating factors, and one of the important ones is, of course, demography. And we've talked about this in terms of its potential a moment ago. But as far as the Israelis are concerned, and the Israelis are the dominating force determining outcomes in the area, this is a significant complicating factor, and it is a complicating factor which very much led to what the Israelis called the disengagement in 2005, which was essentially based on a very simple cost-benefit analysis for the Israelis. It does not make sense for the Israelis to have a few thousand settlers embedded among 2 million Palestinians in a tiny strip of territory that they could very easily control from the outside. And so that cost-benefit analysis led to the decision of disengagement, which was, of course, uncoordinated with the Palestinian Authority at the time for good reason, and shifted the occupation from a permanent interior presence to an occupation that involved a constant exterior presence, which, of course, as we know, exercises the ability to enter at will when it pleases. This has had significant political ramifications, which I'll discuss in a moment. But an additional complicating factor that is inherent to the Gaza Strip is the matter of geography. And if we are talking about a Palestinian state existing on the territory occupied in 1967, there's no getting around the reality that the West Bank and Gaza are separated by a huge mass of land that is entirely controlled by Israel and can at any point under under Israeli whims be separated and divided again permanently. And so even under the best case scenario of a two-state framework and an independent Palestinian state, the connection between the West Bank, which is the majority of the land of that territory, and Gaza, which, as I have described, is a integral part of the Palestinian nation, would always be subject to the whims of the Israeli state. This has been part and parcel of what I believe is a long-standing divide and rule policy that the Israelis have had, which is very similar to the divide and rule policies we are all familiar with in colonial enterprises of the past, and one that I believe exists today, but also goes back to the very foundation of the state and even before the foundation of the state as well. The Israelis have worked to foment political separation on top of geographic separation in their engagement with the Palestinians. I believe that the first stage of this was the effort that collapsed the PLO into the PA, separating Palestinians inside historic Palestine from Palestinians in exile and in refugee camps. What this essentially did was reshape the interests of Palestinian stakeholders and reshape the structures of Palestinian representative institutions to the point where the emphasis was no longer on the rights of refugees or the perspectives of those in exile, but focused like a laser on the situation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And I believe this did weaken the Palestinian National Project. The second stage of this fomentation of political separation was the effort to split the PA into the PA of Gaza and the PA of the West Bank. And this, of course, has also had devastating consequences for the Palestinian national project. And yes, certainly the Israelis benefit from this precisely because it weakens Palestinians, but also because it shifts any onus from the Israelis onto Palestinians, who they can blame for being disunited and incapable of engaging in any serious process. And the Israelis, in fact, very much intended this as part of the disengagement decision, and hoped to create an untenable security situation, while at the same time demanding that peace process progress be tied to Palestinians' ability to provide security. So they introduced, through the disengagement process, the creation of impossible to reach benchmarks, which essentially brought the process to a halt. How can we make peace while there is violence, the Israelis will say, while there are people who deny our existence? Who do we make peace with, the Palestinians in Gaza or the Palestinians in the West Bank? And I would draw your attention to the comments made by the top aide of the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Dov Weissglass, who was serving Ariel Sharon during the decision-making around the disengagement. And this was quoted in Haaretz in October of 2004. And I will just read this to you to highlight the point. The significance of the disengagement plan, this is Ariel Sharon's aide, Dov Weissglass, speaking. The significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent the discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. And all this with authority and permission, all with a presidential blessing and the ratification of both houses of Congress. The disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so that there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. It's unfortunate to say that the objectives outlined by Weissglass seem to have very much succeeded, in part because the Israelis have continued to pursue a policy of keeping Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza divided, but also because of the failure of Palestinian leaders to view their common interests and the common national interests above those efforts by the Israelis. But it's also important to note that a key factor in fomenting this separation has been the U.S.-led peace process. And a key example of this, a key example of the way that that peace process, in fact, has been an engine of political division among Palestinians, is the role the United States played before and after the Palestinian legislative elections in 2006, where in the lead up to that election, all the United States continued to say was, we must democratize the PA, we must have elections, the process cannot move forward until these reforms are met within Palestinian representative structures, where the involvement of all Palestinian parties was being welcomed just a month before the election, until the outcome of the election, of course, was made clear, where the Change and Reform Party, which was essentially Hamas, became the governing party, and where U.S. policy toward the Palestinian Authority and towards the leadership of the PLO became, it's either us or them, you choose. And knowing very well the importance of U.S. support, it's unfortunate to say that some Palestinian leaders chose against national unity, but instead towards appeasing this policy of division to say the least. I will end on a hopeful note that I do believe that Palestinians, in large part, are now moving away from the paradigm of U.S.-led negotiations. I think the vast majority of Palestinians, including many Palestinian leaders, realize that that process has not led them in any good direction, but has in fact only been to their detriment, having witnessed that over the multi-decade-long period of this process that Israeli settlements have only continued to expand, and the settler population has increased thrice-fold. That is very important because it allows for an opportunity for Palestinian national unity to emerge towards projects that are different than the American-led peace process, including the effort to internationalize the process, to bring pressure on Israel outside of the peace process and through international fora, but also through the effort to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, which, if you look at the most recent polling numbers out of the West Bank and Gaza, you will find has 86% of the support of the Palestinian people. Very few agenda issues have been able to garner that degree of support among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are divided in terms of party loyalty, according to the same polling, with about 29% for Fatah, 23% for Hamas, and a variety of other smaller parties garnering support as well. But when you look at the support for all Palestinian parties combined, they still do not approximate the degree of support among the Palestinian population for the effort to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. This does not offer Palestinians a political alternative, but it affords them an agenda behind which, irrespective of political affiliation, they can find a path toward unified struggle. And so on that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, and now we'll have Dr. Brown.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thanks for having me back to the Palestine Center. It's been a while since I was here. The last time I was here, a guy named USled used to be running the place, and I come back and he's still here. In loyalty and deference, I guess, to his leadership, not only of the Palestine Center in the past, but of this panel, I'm going to basically, I think, wind up at the same place, but I'm going to go there a different route. I mean, he basically gave us a tour of demography, of history, a little bit of politics. I'm going to sort of, I think, come, as I say, to a similar kind of conclusion, but a tour much more kind of the current policy atmosphere and the political positions of the various parties. But I'm going to start with a statement that I like to quote all the time because I think it captures the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really very, very well. A diplomatic statement issued by the Quartet, this coalition of 4 international actors, the United States, the EU, Russia, and the UN, which meets quarterly. I think they still meet quarterly and issue statements, and that's basically what they do. And about 7 or 8 years ago, they issued a statement that began, "The situation continues to be unsustainable." Okay. And I think that's still the case. The situation continues to be unsustainable. And one of the main reasons for that continuity, I think, has to do with the approach to Gaza. And I'm actually very glad to see the Palestine Center starting with Gaza, or essentially running this whole series based around Gaza, because in a sense, Gaza's been a footnote to everybody in sort of the policy world's attention. It's kind of like, we're going to handle this. Gaza will have to wait because the problem is too big, too thorny, and so on. And that has been a policy that is, I think, actually widely shared. Most political actors, most of the major political actors, in a sense, buy into that. Gaza can wait for a variety of reasons. The status quo is better than any conceivable short-term alternative. And I want to run through the actors and who can agree on nothing else, and show how it has been in their short-term interest. And let me start with the party that's actually basically in control of Gaza, Hamas. Why is it that Hamas, a movement that dedicates, I mean, its formal name is the Movement of Islamic Resistance, in governing Gaza, as movements of as members of the movement like to say, I mean, we're no longer a movement, we're no longer Islamic, and we're no longer resisting. So why is it that it is so, that in essence, Hamas kind of holds itself up in governance in Gaza, even after, a little over a year ago, formally resigning governmental positions? The fact is that Hamas is in day-to-day control of administration security in the Gaza Strip. And the reason is, essentially, that's what they've got, and that's one card that they have to play. They can basically show to the Palestinian people, I think, that they have some capability of running day-to-day affairs, and that they can somehow administer things a little bit better. They can actually, Gaza provides probably the freest atmosphere for Hamas ever to organize in its history. I was talking to a Hamas supporter in the West Bank. This was 6 months or so ago, and I talked to him about the idea, various possibilities. There's one thing that the war proved to Hamas supporters was essentially, look what would have happened, say, if Hamas had given up arms prior to that, had given up sort of security control of Gaza. Things would have been so much worse. So in a sense, in the short term, there's every reason for Hamas to hold on control of Gaza. What about for the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, that is essentially, now a rump Palestinian leadership, only able to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, basically, essentially controls only the affairs of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinians in the diaspora kind of fell off. Palestinian citizens of Israel kind of fell off. And then they lose essentially 40% of this Palestinian population. How is it in their short-term interest? Well, once again, Gaza is a sort of coming to terms with Hamas, coming to some kind of modus vivendi with Hamas, would essentially cut off access to any kind of international diplomatic process, because Hamas is an international pariah, and it also would mean essentially giving up control of the Palestinian national movement. The generation, the top leadership in Ramallah is, I think, sees itself as having this historical responsibility of having built this Palestinian national movement, and the last thing that they want to do is to surrender over part of control to Islamists. And in terms of the tremendous, when a national unity government was formed, or a national consensus government was formed a little over a year ago, the odd thing is that since that point, it has been the leadership in Ramallah, as much as anybody else, that has been anxious to make sure that that cabinet, the joint cabinet that was formed, the technocratic cabinet that was formed, not administer Gaza on a day-to-day level, because then they're essentially going to have to take responsibility for administering the day-to-day affairs of the Gaza Strip. So in a sense, the leadership in Ramallah is also participating in this system in which Gaza is just forgotten and marginalized. For the Israelis as well, I mean, you sort of went into some of this about why it is essentially functional for them. It may give them, in a sense, for the more cynical interpretation, which is to some extent justified, is that it gives them an excuse to avoid any kind of diplomacy or serious diplomacy with the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank that can't speak for the Palestinian population. And the fact is that of all the alternatives that face Israel, a Gaza Strip that is controlled by Hamas, and a Hamas that has something to lose and therefore can be exposed to all kinds of military and economic pressure, is short-term acceptable for Israel. For the international community, and by the international community, the sort of the final actor in this, I basically mean the United States and to a lesser but perhaps growing extent European Union as well. any kind of diplomatic process looks like it's going to run asunder if it tries to tackle the issue of Gaza. The idea of somehow incorporating Gaza into any kind of diplomatic efforts has been one that would perhaps alienate the Israelis because of Hamas control of Gaza. It would essentially make the two-state diplomacy of the kind that has been kind of dominating the international agenda really for the last 15 years or so, I think look much, much more difficult. So the sort of the dominant approach, especially in the United States, but that Europe has basically signed on to with varying degrees of reluctance, is to say there's a peace process that's going on. That peace process is between the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, and Gaza can wait. We'll handle Gaza after we handle the peace process. So all international actors, all the significant actors involved, are participating in a situation and have some short-term interest in a sense accepting a situation by which Gaza is marginalized, Gaza is forgotten, Gaza is kind of signed off to Hamas as long as it sort of stays contained within Gaza, and then there's episodic violence there is, and war, there is some short-term attention to it, but that attention ebbs as soon as the fighting ends. So it's in everybody's interest. Now there's one party that I left out, as people who live in Gaza, right? And I guess if you factor them in, then all of a sudden this beautiful picture begins to get a little bit more difficult, because it's obviously an extremely difficult position, and the extent of which I think, partly because of Gaza's isolation, can't really be brought home unless you really confront it centrally. I mean, this is a population that has lived under some form of blockade, actually dating back to the mid-1990s. Actually, the walling off of Gaza began right at the same time as the Oslo agreements were signed. So from the very beginning of the peace process, some kind of isolation of Gaza was part of this. And then, of course, with the Palestinian, as well, with the Second Intifada, this was stepped up, and then with the Palestinian Civil War in 2007, ending up with Hamas control of Gaza, you've got a blockade on Gaza that is absolutely devastating and punishing. Violence and wars and all the destruction of that aside, the fact is you've got a society which has basically had its economy fundamentally hollowed out, is kept aside on international, kept afloat on international largesse. This is a situation in which, the quartet statement, the situation continues to be unsustainable, really begins to kind of bring home the reality of the situation. It is not a sustainable situation, except it is sustained year after year after year. And again, with the devastation of these periodic wars, and last summer's war being especially destructive, sort of the true horror of this is actually, in some ways, perhaps a better place to start. Well, I do have what will pass for some good news here, is that realization that pushing Gaza aside doesn't necessarily make sense, I think is beginning to sink into some of those actors that I just talked about. And let me go through them in order and talk about how I think I see some signs of kind of rethinking of the marginalization of Gaza, or making Gaza second or on everybody's agenda or a footnote. With regard to Hamas, control of Gaza was never in Hamas's long-term agenda. And I think there's a realization within the movement that, in a sense, one Jordanian Islamist mentioned to me, it's like they fell into a trap. And you can take a conspiratorial view of that and say it was planned, and a non-conspiratorial view of that and say it's what happened. But whatever, there's no long-term interest for Hamas in simply serving as a governing municipal authority or set of municipal authorities in Gaza. And really, I think over the last couple of years or so, especially, there's been a steady attempt by various factions within the movement to try and think of some alternative. And there are all kinds of alternatives out there, none of which look especially promising. But I think that we do see signs within the movement that they are, in a sense, grasping for alternatives, none of which they've coalesced around. With regard to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, my own sense is that the very top leadership leadership is, in a sense, in a little bit in a petulant mood. They hung everything on a peace process that is simply not delivering everything. When you get below the level of the very top leadership in Ramallah, I think the simple fact is that most Palestinians in the West Bank have given up on their existing governing structures, right? The Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to be the kernel of a Palestinian state, is not leading in that direction. And it continues because it employs people, it continues because it educates people, and it continues because it, will regulate traffic and weights and measures and this sorts of things, but it no longer is seen as bearing much relation at all to the Palestinian national movement, and therefore sort of holding on to this current situation is one in which I think simply has no hold on Palestinian political imagination. And again, you're dealing with a population that is looking for alternatives, has not coalesced around any specific alternative, but the idea that the leadership in Ramallah, the top leadership in Ramallah, sort of speaks for any kind of constituency, I think is something that is no longer persuasive to most observers of Palestinian society and politics. And finally, in the international community, I think there is a growing realization that the idea that there is a meaningful peace process between an Israeli leadership and a Palestinian leadership in Ramallah that can produce a two-state solution, that idea, which was, I thought, the idea that wouldn't die, is dying. It's not necessarily 100% dead. There are some people who still apparently believe in it, but the true believers are very, very small, I think, in number, even in the United States government and especially in Europe. And so the idea that Gaza has to be forgotten because all we have to do is get back to Camp David, all we have to do is get back to Taba, all we have to do is get back to, I don't know, Y or 100 little small towns throughout the world where we had like Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, and after you get an agreement, after you finally have an Israeli prime minister and a Palestinian prime minister or Palestinian president sign on the dotted line, then you can handle the problem of Gaza. That idea doesn't persuade much of anybody anymore. And so you have some openness to the idea of essentially alternative approaches to this that are no longer oriented around the idea that there's a known solution out there of two-state solution that we're just right on the brink of, and that anything that distracts from that or detracts from that has to be forgotten and pushed aside. Again, none of these actors is coalescing around any kind of alternative, and I don't think that's likely to happen anytime soon. What I do think, what I think is possible and I think would be advisable would be, in a sense, taking advantage of the current moment when you have at least this summer, a little bit of respite, a little bit of calm, and willingness on the part of all parties involved to sort of rethink approaches that have gone on, that people have sort of mindlessly followed for the last a decade, 2 decades or so. And I think I'd go back in a sense to sort of where Yusuf ended his talk. He talked a little bit about the aftermath of the Palestinian elections of 2006, when, in a sense, some of the roots for the current crisis, the current isolation of Gaza, were planted. With the triumph of Gaza of Hamas in those elections, and then a year later with the Palestinian split. Something in Palestinian politics broke in 2007, deeply and fundamentally, in ways that I think served nobody's purpose, long-term purposes, very well. And what I mean by that is that you have, in one sense with Palestinian society and politics, you have something remarkable, unusual, in comparative terms. You have really I think the rootedness, a strong rootedness of Palestinian national identity. The Palestinians aren't the first people to invent national identity, but they're one of the few peoples to have built up a very strong national identity without any of the accoutrements of statehood, right? Usually states are the ones that kind of build and define this identity, and they do so through educational curricula, they do so through all kinds of policies, citizenship policies, laws, and so forth and so on. Palestinian national identity was very much more kind of built from the ground up. But from the basically from the 1960s on, you have connected with this kind of ethos of Palestinian national identity, a host of institutions and a host of organizations that were set up that really began to be able to speak authoritatively for Palestinians. You had the political factions, I mean, Fatah and all the other organizations built up basically going back to the 1950s. You have the Palestinian Liberation Organization emerge. You have Palestine. You have some of these actors being able to take the seat in international settings, be able to, the PLO's greatest accomplishment was to be seen as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And you have, in a sense, a Palestinian Authority, the construction of the Palestinian Authority from 1993, 1994 onwards in the West Bank and Gaza as part of that, as what looked to Palestinians like a steady state march towards statehood. And in 2007, that came to an end. It came to an end because that Palestinian Authority split in two, and no longer did you have a single Palestinian Authority. The PLO was, in essence, at that point, basically a hollowed-out institution. And I think it was about that sometime in that decade when the idea that you had a political process that could lead to that was leading meaningfully or in any kind of linear way or even non-linear way towards a Palestinian state was one that became much less persuasive. So when I say that something in Palestinian politics broke in 2007, and to some extent a little bit before and a little bit after as well, what I mean is that at that point, it became very difficult for anybody, I think, to speak authoritatively for Palestinians, for any kind of institution to legitimately say or to guide Palestinians in any kind of direction. And a lot of the deep malaise and despair in Palestinian society right now is the sense that their problems have gotten worse, but they have no tools, and they have no leaders, and they have no institutions by which to address them. So the beginning of a different kind of approach, which I think it is in everybody's long-term interest, including non-Palestinian parties, to adopt, would be one that would take Palestinian politics and the reconstruction of Palestinian politics as a positive step. And there are specific things that could be done in that regard. A Palestinian, some kind of bringing back together the West Bank and Gaza, I think, internationally, and even for the Israelis' terms, it will have to eventually have to come to account with this Palestinian national movement, would be a positive step. All sorts of things. Palestinian local elections, I think, would basically force existing Palestinian factions and leaders, those people who claim to be able to speak for Palestinians, to have to go to voters for support to be able to show some kind of administrative ability of a kind that they don't have to show right now. National elections would cause all kinds of diplomatic difficulties, but I think they would be a positive step as well. Some unfreezing of the really problematic authoritarian environment in both the West Bank and Gaza, where dissident voices, dissident political parties, dissident newspapers, dissident NGOs are shut down. Some kind of revival of Palestinian political life, I think, would be very positive. Up till now, I think most international actors and most authoritative actors within Palestinian politics have essentially moved against those directions. The idea that there should be Palestinian elections is one that both Hamas and Fatah agree is better put off till later. They just like to blame the other for the delay. The idea of Palestinian elections or some kind of freeing of Palestinian political life is one that would require Israeli assent, which I think is one that Israel has in a sense tried to maintain tight control over. And the idea that Palestinians should essentially be organizing their own politics and own affairs is one which the international community has heartily endorsed, so long as Palestinians make the right choices. And sometimes they don't make the choices that international diplomacy would most like them to make. But I think, again, because we're at a moment in which the diplomatic attention is elsewhere, on Iran, on Iraq and Syria, and so forth and so on, we're at a moment at which I think it may be possible to and we're also at a moment in which I think most actors have are beginning to come to terms with the the fact that existing policies and existing trends serve nobody's long-term interests, it would be a good time to fundamentally rethink things. Do I think that's going to happen? Probably not, or probably not in a constructive way. But I think this is an opportunity. Many opportunities have been missed in the past, but the present moment may be an opportunity which I think 5 or 10 years from now, if is not grasped, people will point to as a great mistake. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our panelists for speaking with very eye-opening remarks. And now we're going to turn to our question and answer period.
Thank you. My name is Said Erekat. I'm a Palestinian journalist. Two-part question. The first part is to Dr. Bunaya. We keep hearing that Gaza will be unlivable by 2020. What does that mean, especially in view of probably an imminent war, another war with Israel? And to Dr. Brown, you said that Hamas was almost trapped into this situation. Can you envision a situation where Hamas actually would give up power, and what would happen? What is likely to happen? Thank you.
I think Gaza's already in a situation, if you talk to most people there, would tell you that it's unlivable today. But the organizations that work on international development in the international community have specific definitions for these kinds of things in terms of the extent to which any territory can continue to sustain economically and in terms of humanitarian development on its own. I think we've long since passed that point. 80% of the population in Gaza today relies on handouts from the international community for daily sustenance. And the wars that we've seen over recent years have only exacerbated that crisis. Sarah Roy, I would reference you to the talk that she gave here in the past about some of the indicators in terms of development or de-development in the Gaza Strip and the direction things have been going, and the report that the UN did on the 2020 mark, which outlines all of this. But for people on the ground, they're not looking to 2020. They're looking to tomorrow and wondering if they're going to, what their lives are going to be like and how they're going to be able to provide for their families and so on. And the situation is quite dire. I think actually, that number, 2020, puts off the situation and does not really represent how serious it is. And you're absolutely right about the prospect of another war. None of the underlying conditions of the previous wars have been properly addressed. There's no independent or credible monitoring system of the ceasefire mechanism. It's just a matter of time before that erupts again. And as we've seen, these wars have become increasingly difficult to contain. The United States' waning influence in the region has made it harder and harder for them to bring any war like that to a conclusion. And ultimately, it's the civilian population in the Gaza Strip that sees the worst effects of these wars. So I think the situation is more urgent than those reports even indicate.
The question is, can I imagine Hamas giving up power? Yes, absolutely. I can imagine it. There was no point at which Hamas said, we want to be in this position of running Gaza and nothing else and bottled up in Gaza. This was not something that they got to by choice, or one that is, I think, consistent with the long-term interests or goals or the mission of the organization as it defines itself. It's simply that any step forward is less palatable. So Hamas is not going to dissolve, and it's not going to disarm, and it's not going to recognize Israel. It's certainly not going to recognize Israel as sort of part of any kind of effort to bring it in from the tent. But I could imagine ways in which there are things that Hamas would want in terms of sort of, I think, re-entry into Palestinian politics and society outside of Gaza, some kind of international recognition of its role and so on. In some ways, I think the idea of administering Gaza is low on the organization's priorities. So there could be ways, but it would require, in essence, I think, concessions that would amount to accepting Hamas as a legitimate political player within Palestinian society, both domestically and internationally. And that's a stumbling block, and that's a big one.
Gentleman on the right.
Thanks. I'm Paul Sham. I teach at the University of Maryland. I know you've both heard in the last month or two there have been very credible reports of Hamas-Israeli meetings in which they're secretly but apparently sort of normalizing their relationship. And also that France, of course, is supposed to introduce a resolution in the UN that the U.S. conceivably might not veto. That would either of those things perhaps have a Gaza component that might include European or international troops on the Gaza border that might relieve the siege somewhat. In other words, are these perhaps harbingers of something more positive happening in the next year?
One thing I would just note in relation to reports about ties between Israel and Hamas and normalization on that front. One thing I did not mention in my comments, but I think we should all be very wary of, is the other two-state solution. Or at least what's talked about as the other two-state solution by many Israelis. Not the two-state solution that we may all be familiar with conventionally, but the notion of a greater Israel being one state, which incorporates the West Bank, and a separate entity in Gaza that it has semi-normal or less than normal relations with. There are many people in the upper echelons of Israeli policymaking which do not see the two-state solution, to put it lightly, as a preferred option, and many who actually see that other two-state solution as the preferred option. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind anytime we're talking about whether or not normalization there is a good thing. And I always, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of Israel having, a separate peace or attempts at a separate peace with any portion of the Palestinian population, because I think attempts at that in the past have proven to be disastrous for Palestinians. On the UN front, we'll have to wait and see. It's not really clear what's going to happen. I think, the next couple months are going to tell us a lot about where the international community's agenda is going to go in terms of the Middle East. And I think there's great potential for change there, but we'll have to see. But personally, I've been in favor for some time of having an independent and credible third-party monitor to actually verify the ceasefires, because as I see it, in the overwhelming majority of instances, it's the Israelis that are violating the ceasefire and driving escalation with Gaza. And that it would only be to the benefit of Palestinians to have a third party there that can ensure that Israel lives up to its commitments. The problem is that the Israelis have not wanted to relinquish control to a third party, and they've unfortunately had Washington's backing on this issue as well.
Let me just weigh in briefly. I think largely in line with Yusuf's comments. On the first, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure necessarily what we're really looking for is, or what's likely to come out of any of those kinds of contacts would be a solution, right? The idea that Israel and Hamas could negotiate with each other, well, that should not be news. We shouldn't have to rely on secret reports. In a sense, they negotiate with each other all the time. They do so through newspaper headlines and they do so through violence. But a lot of this is negotiating a way in which the two sides will deal with each other. And sometimes it's explicit, as it was during the last summer's war. And you've got, like, Palestinian officials. I remember at one point, reading this headline about, like, Israel is not going to show up in Cairo because Islamic Jihad is not going to show up. So, what's going on here? It's like the Israelis are now demanding Islamic Jihad negotiate with them. I mean, when you get to practical details, there's an awful lot of willingness to think outside kind of these almost, received categories or slogans. The fact is they do deal with each other. And it's no longer really a left-right issue in Israel. In some ways, people on the right are, for the reasons that you just said, are more, willing to deal with Hamas. Whether this can lead to any, I'm not necessarily sure it's a bad thing if it leads to some kind of a short-term workable arrangement. My problem with it is what kind of long-term process is it harnessed to? I mean, that is the real question. And if it means some kind of unfreezing of frozen diplomatic attitudes, that's probably a good thing. But where it leads long-term, I don't know. In terms of the second about the possibility of a French resolution, which has been kind of on and off the table for the past year or so, maybe coming back, I'd sort of make the same point that Yusuf did in a more abstract way and in a way that is, I think, sort of puts it a little bit differently from the Israeli position. Yusuf is absolutely right. I mean, internationalization has been, in the eyes of almost all Israeli leaders, bad, right? And it's understandable. They're the stronger party. They sit down directly with the Palestinians, who comes out on top. The Israelis do. They hold 90% of the cards. And if they want any intermediate, it's going to be the Americans, who tend to see things their way. That's great if what you're trying to do is get through the next year. It's not a good way. That kind of inequality is not going to lead to any kind of long-term sustainable agreement. I don't think internationalization, I don't think I'd be able to persuade many Israeli leaders that I don't think internationalization is a bad thing from the Israeli point of view. Doing things in accordance with established rules of international behavior are ones that actually offer Israel some protection. Israel is a recognized member of the United Nations, okay? This is not necessarily bad if what you're focusing on is a long-term solution rather than short-term diplomatic victories. So I think internationalization is probably good, and the way that the United States has essentially operated so far is to behave in international fora as if its job is to protect Israel from the worst effects of its own mistakes. And I'm not sure that serves them well long term.
So we've got a question from Twitter before we move to any other in person. And the question is, could you speak to the role of the Palestinian diaspora and transnational networks in developing Gaza West Bank solidarity?
That's your job, right? You do this for a living.
Well,
not really.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question. There's a big role that civil society is playing. It continues to play, including Palestinian and international civil society. And one of the things that I mentioned towards the end of my comments was specifically the role of Palestinian civil society and driving the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and the extent to which that movement has garnered political support among Palestinians of all stripes. The strategy for some Palestinian political parties has seen armed struggle as central to progress. And other parties have seen negotiation and engagement with the West as central to any progress. And that divide has been part of a significant division that could not be bridged for a very long time. What I think has happened over recent years is there has been a middle ground that these movements offer, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and the internationalization offers, which is a strategy that believes that pressure on Israel is central to progress, but that it should be nonviolent pressure. And it is an opportunity that allows people from both camps to unify behind a central movement. And I think civil society actors, transnational actors have been central in that.
So we're running out of time, but we'll take 2 questions at once and then we'll close it out. So, sir. 2 questions. So.
Hello, my name is Baha Al-Dahoudi, and as a Palestinian from Gaza, I would like to thank the Jerusalem Fund, the Palestinian Center and Jerusalem Fund for this event, and I would also like to thank the panelists for putting a clear picture of what is exactly happening in Gaza. My question is to Dr. Nathan regarding the Palestinian elections. Do you really think that a Palestinian election could be a good step right now for the unification of the Palestinians, considering how shattered the Palestinian society is and how confused the Palestinians in the diaspora are? So you would look at the Palestinian political map right now and you would be completely overwhelmed with the potential successors and leaders who could be president, the next president or the next prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. So the timing for the elections at this moment, would it be a good step or not?
And then another question. Does anyone have one? Ma'am?
Well, this isn't about internal Palestinian politics, but it's about particularly the attitude of the United States. We have branded Hamas as an international sponsor of terrorism. We've recently come to accommodation with Cuba, and there's recent developments with Iran. And I'm wondering, short of Hamas saying that they will accept, that they may not accept the existence of Israel, but they don't want to destroy it, there are changes, it seems to me. We say that Iran is one of the sponsors of Hamas, and Hamas is already disassociated with support of Assad, unlike Hezbollah. We always lump Hezbollah with Hamas, although they're different. And it seems to me that we have reports anyway of ISIS and other things operating within Hamas. I don't know, within Gaza. I don't know if there's any truth to that as a real threat, but it seems to me that all these changes in the foreign policy situation might lead to United States deciding to stop branding Hamas as an international sponsor of terrorism, which would open the way to maybe absence of the complete marginalization of Gaza as far as we're concerned.
Thank you.
Let me handle it first. I'll leave this second to Yusuf. That's okay. Would Palestinian elections right now be a good idea given the state of Palestinian politics and society? Absolutely. Precisely for that reason. Because you have essentially aged leaderships that have very little legitimacy, and I think there are no mechanisms which really force them to, I think, be held accountable to the people that they claim to represent. That's one thing that's missing in Palestinian politics. So yes, it would be a very, very disorienting time, I think, because you've got a Hamas movement that performed well electorally back in 2006, but at this point there's like 9 years of a very uneven record, which I'm not sure I would necessarily want to run on, especially in a place like Gaza. And you've got what refers to itself as kind of the national camp that is extremely disorganized. That is part of the disease, it seems to me, of Palestinian politics. This aging and unaccountable leadership, and anything that developed essentially new blood and that forced leaders to, in essence, sketch out realistic programs to their own people and go back and sort of rebuild some kind of grassroots popular movement and popular mobilization, I think would be very healthy. It's not going to lead to any kind of an immediate solution for anybody, but I don't see any way in which the situation can move forward in any direction absent some fresh Palestinian leadership.
In regard to your question, I think there's an opportunity now for things to change in the region. I think part of that opportunity is rooted in the fact that American interests in the region are starting to change, and I think there's starting to be an understanding of that with American policymakers. The long-term, long-held view about the importance of American hegemony in the region is starting to change a little bit, and it's freaked out a number of players in the region. And I think that it does potentially offer an opportunity for openings on the Israeli-Palestinian question. Obviously, the issue. If you think Iran is a hot button issue in Washington, and when it comes to the Israel issue and pro-Israel interest groups, you could just imagine what trying to engage Hamas would be like. So I don't see that happening in the near term anytime soon. That being said, if you are seriously for a negotiated solution, it seems to me one cannot be seen as credible if not working for a representative and unified Palestinian partner which is going to actually do the negotiating. And that has been one of the major problems in U.S. policy on this issue for a number of years, because they've sought a negotiated solution with leaders who do not have the mandate to deliver. And it's one of the reasons why this process has not been able to move forward. And it's another one of those instances where domestic political interests get in the way of advancing foreign policy in the way that foreign policy makers might like to see it happen.
And I'm afraid that's all we have time for, so I'd like to thank our panelists again. And thank you all for coming.